My daughter-in-law said, "You're not on the $64.00, MD'd." At closing, the realtor looked straight at me and said, "Ready to sign?" My daughter-in-law shoved me to the floor, the cold marble striking my palms as I caught myself, then yanked my chair to the farthest corner and hissed, "$64 million? Are you delusional? Or should I throw you into a nursing home or a mental hospital? You choose." The sound of my purse hitting the ground echoed louder than her voice. I could feel the heat of every pair of eyes in the room, not out of concern, but from the awkwardness of witnessing a humiliation they had no intention of stopping. The realtor froze mid-step, his pen poised above the folder in his hands. The other guests, lawyers, investors, and onlookers dressed in crisp suits, shifted in their chairs, their discomfort palpable. I pushed myself up slowly, steadying my balance before straightening my coat. My son, who had been speaking with the mortgage broker, turned just enough to look at me without really seeing me. His voice was flat, dismissive, carrying none of the warmth a child should have for his mother. "Mother, you are too old to understand anything about real estate," he said, as if delivering a fact rather than an insult. "Do not waste everyone's time." The air in the room grew heavy. The scent of expensive coffee and polished wood suddenly felt suffocating. My daughter-in-law turned toward me again, her lips curling into a thin smile that pretended to be polite, but dripped with venom. "You are nothing more than a tenant in our home," she said with deliberate clarity, "and I swear you will never set foot in that estate once it is ours." The scrape of the chair she had moved still rang in my ears as I picked up my purse from the floor and walked to the corner she had chosen for me. The spot was dim, away from the warm sunlight pouring through the glass walls, and far from the center of the table where the real decisions were being made. I placed my purse gently on the table beside me, sat down, and folded my hands neatly in my lap. From where I sat, I had a clear view of the contract in the center of the table. Thick, cream-colored pages edged with gold clips, each one holding the weight of the $64 million they thought was theirs. I could see their faces, too, my son's focused and calculating, my daughter-in-law's smug and certain of her victory. The realtor, regaining his composure, began outlining the order of the closing. His voice was smooth and practiced, but his eyes avoided mine. Pens began scratching across the paper as the first signatures were placed. Chairs shifted. Glasses of water were sipped. Life went on as though I had simply ceased to exist in that space. But I was still there. I was watching. Every so often, someone would glance at me. Brief, almost guilty glances, before quickly looking away. It was as though acknowledging me might disrupt the delicate balance of civility they were all pretending to maintain. Their words replayed in my mind like a recording. 64 million, delusional, nursing home, mental hospital, tenant, never set foot. Each phrase settled deep within me, not as a fresh wound, but as another brick in the wall I had been building for years. They thought their insults were sharp enough to cut me down. What they did not understand was that I had lived through sharper, colder words than theirs. I kept my face calm, my posture straight, my breathing even. To them, I must have looked like a relic, quiet, harmless, irrelevant. They had no idea that silence can be the sharpest weapon of all, that patience can be more dangerous than rage. So I sat there, half in shadow, letting them believe what they wanted to believe. Let them think they had succeeded in pushing me aside. Let them believe the seat in the corner meant defeat. I knew something they didn't, something that would turn this day upside down before it was over. And as their pens scratched across the final pages, I smiled, just enough for myself, not enough for anyone else to see. They say the worst wounds are the ones that never bleed. Mine were the kind carved out slowly, over years, with words and small acts that everyone else would dismiss as nothing. But I remembered every one of them. My name is Merlin Rope, though most people just call me Maggie. I was born in a small fishing town on the Oregon coast, and I've spent most of my 74 years working hard, keeping quiet, and minding my own business. But quiet does not mean weak, and on that day, sitting in that glossy real estate office, I was anything but weak. I still recall the first time my daughter-in-law introduced me to her friends. I had spent the entire morning preparing snacks, cleaning the living room, and making sure the house looked perfect. When the doorbell rang, I expected at least a polite introduction, perhaps as my husband's mother. Instead, With her brightest social smile, she gestured toward me and said, "This is our longtime housekeeper." Her friends laughed lightly, thinking it was a joke, but she never corrected them. I stood there holding a tray of tea and cookies, the heat from the cups warming my fingers, while the cold in my chest spread deeper. It was not an isolated moment. That same air of condescension bled into everything. I took pride in my little vegetable patch in the backyard, rows of lettuce, tomatoes, and herbs I had tended since before they moved in. One morning I found the compost bin overflowing with perfectly good vegetables. My daughter-in-law caught my gaze from the patio and shrugged. "They're not certified organic like the store sells," she said. "I don't trust what you grow in the dirt out there." As if the earth I had cared for my whole life was somehow beneath her standards. I tried to bring something of my own to the house once, a beautiful solid oak dining table I had found at an estate sale, the kind of piece meant to last generations. I polished it until it shone and placed it in the dining room. That evening she walked in, took one look, and laughed. "This old thing? It looks like it belongs in a cabin fireplace. We could burn it for warmth in the winter." The next day it was gone, replaced by a glass and chrome table that looked cold no matter what meal was set upon it. They began to chip away at my place in the house in more tangible ways. One month my son sat me down at the kitchen table, papers in hand, and explained that I would now be responsible for my own utility costs. "It's only fair," he said. "You have your own room, you use electricity." What he did not say, and perhaps had conveniently forgotten, was that I had paid off the remaining mortgage on this house years earlier, emptying my savings so they could keep it. That didn't count for much anymore. Then there was the matter of my wedding ring. It was the one thing I had left from my husband, simple gold, worn smooth from decades of love and work. When they started dabbling in the stock market, my son suggested I sell it. We could use that money for investments, make it grow. When I refused, my daughter-in-law scoffed. "You're just selfish, clinging to a couple of rusty rocks." She said it as if a lifetime of marriage could be reduced to scrap metal in her eyes. But the worst came when I fell ill. It was nothing dramatic at first, a cough that lingered, a fever that would not break. But it landed me in the hospital for a week. I thought about the comfort of returning to my own bed, my own pillow, the quiet corner of the house I had carved out for myself. When I walked through the front door, still pale and tired, I found the door to my room shut. A stranger's suitcase sat by the hall. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice still hoarse. "Oh," my daughter-in-law said casually, as though explaining why she'd changed the curtains. "We decided to rent out your room. The extra money helps with bills. You can stay in the basement for now." The basement was unfinished concrete, cold even in summer. "You rented out my room while I was in the hospital?" I could hardly get the words out. "It's not a big deal," my son said from the kitchen doorway. "That rent money helps us feed one less mouth. You should be grateful." Grateful? For being treated like an unwanted tenant in the house I had saved? That night, I lay awake in the basement, the hum of the water heater my only company. Above me, I could hear laughter and the clinking of glasses. They had guests over, dining and talking in the rooms that used to feel like home to me. Every slight, every insult, every theft of dignity replayed in my mind like a film. I said nothing. I have learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay silent. But I did not forget. Not one word, not one act. Every memory was stored away, not as bitterness, but as a ledger, a record of debts that would, someday, be settled. When my husband passed away, the grief was like a fog that refused to lift. I moved through the days in slow motion, sorting through his clothes, his papers, the remnants of the life we had built together. Among those papers was his life insurance policy, money he had insisted on maintaining despite the years we spent arguing over monthly expenses. He said it was for when the unthinkable happened. I suppose it had. The check arrived a month later, crisp and impersonal, just numbers on paper. My son and his wife never asked about it, never even acknowledged it. I kept it that way on purpose. They assumed whatever I had would be small, easily ignored. They were wrong. It was enough to make a move that would change everything for me, though no one would see it coming. I contacted Ruth, my oldest friend from childhood. We had not spoken regularly in years, but I knew one thing about her. She was discreet. She had gone into finance, managing portfolios for people who valued privacy above all else. I told her I wanted to set up a trust in another state, one with strong asset protection laws, something so airtight that not even my own family could connect it to me. She didn't ask why, she just asked how much. Within 6 months, the trust was established. On paper, it was Ruth's entity. In reality, it was mine entirely. Through that trust, we began buying shares in various companies, never enough to draw public attention. One of those companies was the very firm that would later develop the $64 million estate my son and daughter-in-law were now so desperate to claim. I bought slowly, quietly, until my holdings reached 40%. Not enough to run the company, but more than enough to control its most important decisions. The opportunity to weave the next thread in my plan came when my son and his wife started talking about moving up in the world. They had their eyes on the estate, prestige, status, everything they thought they deserved. But they didn't have the liquid cash for the deposit. I let Ruth handle the loan through the trust, drafting a contract with terms so specific they would never notice the trap until it snapped shut. The agreement was simple. The trust would provide the initial deposit for their purchase. If the trust declined to release the remaining funds at any point, the entire deal would collapse, and they would forfeit their deposit to the seller. My son skimmed the paperwork, my daughter-in-law pretended to read it, but neither of them saw the hooks buried in the language. Why would they? In their minds, it was just some anonymous investor helping them make the deal happen. From that day on, I watched from my quiet corner of the house as they strutted around, making plans, telling friends about their estate. I kept my head down, cooking my meals, tending my garden, playing the role of the harmless old woman. The more they believed in my helplessness, the more freely they revealed themselves, every greedy impulse, every cruel remark, every smug assumption that I was nothing. Privacy was my shield. The trust was layered through holding companies, each with its own registered agent and mailing address in a different state. My name did not appear on any document. Even if they had the sense to look, they would have found nothing. Ruth handled all correspondence. I never touched a piece of paper directly. The shares in the construction company were listed under the trust's name, as was the loan. On paper, I was invisible. What no one in that room could have guessed was that the trust was not just a silent investor, it was the legal owner of the very parcel of land the estate was being built on. In every registry, the land belonged to the trust, and the trust belonged to me. They thought they were dealing with a faithless financier, never realizing that every brick they coveted was already sitting in my hand. And invisibility has its power. I could sit at the kitchen table while my daughter-in-law boasted over the phone about how the deal was moving forward, how the stupid seller would never see them coming. I could hear my son tell his friends that they'd soon have more space than they knew what to do with, that he might even let me stay in a guest room if I behaved myself. I could listen to them lay out plans for tearing down parts of the house I loved in the promotional photos, and all the while, I knew that none of it would happen without my signature. I played the part so well that sometimes even I almost believed it, that I was just an old woman waiting quietly for life to decide my fate. But late at night, I would sit at my small desk in the basement, looking over the monthly reports Ruth sent me. I saw every dollar moving through the construction company. I knew every delay, every change order, every financial hiccup, and I knew that if I decided not to approve the final release of funds, the whole deal would crumble like a sandcastle under a rising tide. So I waited. I kept my silence, let them think I was irrelevant, let them believe they had me shoved into the far corner of their lives. Because when the moment came, and it would, every insult, every slight, every act of greed would be answered, and they would never see it coming until it was far too late. My daughter-in-law's voice turned syrupy sweet, the kind of tone she used on waiters when she wanted something for free. She slid a neat stack of papers across the table toward me, her manicured fingers tapping the top sheet, as though she were sharing a secret. "Go on, just sign here quickly," she said, smiling wide enough to show every polished tooth. "That way your son won't have to worry about any of this boring paperwork." The papers were crisp, expensive stock, the black ink still smelling faintly fresh. I glanced at the heading in bold type, "Permanent Power of Attorney." A smaller line underneath spelled out what they really wanted: full, irrevocable control over the parcel of land my name still occupied. In the records. In their minds, I was just a decorative placeholder, a signature they needed to clear the last obstacle between them and the estate. I felt my son move closer, his shadow falling over my shoulder. He bent down, close enough that I could feel his breath warm against my ear. "If you don't sign," he murmured, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear, "consider this the end of whatever relationship we have left." For a moment, I let my gaze linger on the neat lines of the text, my fingers resting lightly on the corner of the page. Then I turned it over, slowly, placed it face down on the table, and folded my hands over it. My eyes met his, calm and steady. I did not say a word. The silence spread quickly. The room, once filled with the shuffling of papers and polite murmurs, grew still. The Realtor's hand hovered above his pen, unsure whether to break the moment. Across the table, a lawyer adjusted his glasses but didn't speak. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder. My daughter-in-law's smile faltered. "It's just a formality," she said, her voice tightening at the edges. "We're all on the same side here." The mortgage broker coughed into his fist, glancing between us like a man watching a storm gather over calm water. My son straightened up, his jaw tightening. "Mother," he said more loudly, "do not make this difficult. You have no reason not to sign." I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the paper sit untouched in front of me. I could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing on me, urging me to pick up the pen, to bow to the pressure. But I had carried heavier burdens than this, and I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait. "Perhaps she needs someone to explain it to her," my daughter-in-law offered, turning to the Realtor. Her voice carried that brittle edge again, the one she got when she was 2 seconds from snapping. "She's not used to these kinds of transactions. Maybe if someone spelled it out in simple terms." I raised one hand slightly, and the room went quiet again. I didn't need their explanations. I didn't need their reassurances. I knew exactly what they wanted from me. And I knew exactly how long I had been planning for this moment. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation and impatience. The papers lay between us like bait in a trap, but it wasn't my foot caught in it. I watched my son's expression shift from confidence to irritation, then to the faintest flicker of doubt. My daughter-in-law tapped her nails against the table, each click a little sharper than the last. Still, I did not move. The tension in the room was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. When the door at the far end of the conference room swung open, every head turned. 2 men stepped inside, their polished shoes silent against the marble floor. One I recognized immediately, the project director for the estate's development. The other was the company's lead attorney, a man whose suits were cut so perfectly they seemed almost unreal. The project director walked straight past my son and daughter-in-law without so much as a glance. Stopping at my side, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect I had not seen from anyone in this room until now. "Mrs. Harper," he said clearly enough for every person present to hear, "we have prepared the final contract according to your instructions. If you do not sign, this entire transaction will be canceled immediately." For a heartbeat, the room froze. My daughter-in-law's mouth opened, then closed again. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together as though she'd misheard him. "According to her instructions?" she repeated, her voice climbing half an octave. "What do you mean, her instructions?" The attorney stepped forward, placing a slim leather folder on the table in front of me. His tone was professional, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of deference. "Mrs. Harper is a co-owner of the development company," he explained evenly, "and the sole legal owner of the parcel of land on which this property is built. Without her signature, no sale can proceed to any buyer, regardless of contract status." The words landed like stones dropped into a still pond. I saw it in my son's eyes first. The confident gleam snuffed out in an instant, replaced by confusion, then dawning horror. My daughter-in-law turned sharply toward him. "You said she was just on the paperwork as a formality," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut. My son stopped himself, glancing around at the silent witnesses in the room. His face was tightening, flushing with the realization that whatever private power play they thought they were staging was now unfolding in front of an audience. The Realtor's eyes darted between us, clearly recalculating the entire situation. The mortgage broker shifted uncomfortably in his seat, now fully aware that this was no ordinary closing. The two lawyers seated near the end of the table exchanged quick, knowing glances. I let the silence stretch, just long enough for it to feel heavy. Then I reached out and placed my hand on the leather folder. "It seems," I said softly, "that some of you have misunderstood my role here." My daughter-in-law's composure cracked. "You can't," she began, but the project director cut her off with a small, polite smile. "She can," he said simply. "She can do exactly that." I looked down at the documents laid out before me. They were the culmination of years of quiet maneuvering, shares acquired one at a time, contracts written in careful language, layers of ownership that kept my name invisible until the moment I chose to reveal it. I had been patient enough to let them believe they held the reins. When I looked up, my son was leaning forward, his palms flat on the table. "Mother," he said, his voice tight, "we can work this out privately. Just sign the papers and—" "Privately?" I let the word roll slowly off my tongue. "No, I think we'll keep this right where it is, in the light." His jaw clenched. My daughter-in-law's hands were curled into fists in her lap. The people around the table were silent, but I could feel their attention like a spot. The attorney tapped the top page gently. "Whenever you're ready, Mrs. Harper." I could have signed right then, but I didn't. I let my fingers rest on the pen, my eyes moving deliberately from one face to the next. My son's desperation, my daughter-in-law's fury barely held in check. The faint curiosity in the strangers who had just realized they were witnessing the unraveling of someone's perfect little scheme. "Not yet," I said finally, leaning back in my chair. "I think I'd like to take a moment." And, in that moment, with the truth laid bare on the table between us, I watched their certainty collapse. It was the first time in years that I felt the weight in my chest lift. I pulled my chair back toward the center of the table, the legs scraping deliberately against the polished marble. Every head in the room turned to follow the sound. My son shifted uncomfortably. My daughter-in-law sat rigid, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. I met her eyes and let the moment stretch, my voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "You're right," I said. "I have no name on anything yet. But today, I'm going to put my name on every place you ever dreamed of stepping foot in." She blinked, unsure whether to laugh or frown. My son started to say something, but I was already uncapping the pen. The room was silent, except for the faint, deliberate scratch of the nib across the paper. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, her lips parting in anticipation, until she saw the heading on the document. In my bag was a second set of documents, prepared quietly by the foundation's lawyers over the past month. While my son and his wife had been gloating over their final closing, I had been arranging a closing of my own, one that could be executed in this very room, on this very table, without ever leaving my chair. Every legal clearance, every signature from the city, every stamp, it was all ready, waiting for my pen. It wasn't the sale agreement she thought it was. It wasn't a transfer into their hands. I was signing the estate over to the Haven House Foundation, a nonprofit shelter for elderly women abandoned by their families. I had negotiated it quietly with the foundation's director weeks ago, the final terms waiting only for this moment. And there was one extra clause, printed in clean, unshakable legal language that no one in the room could miss. The property would list 2 honorary sponsors in every publication, every plaque, every fundraising gala, my son and my daughter-in-law, their names forever tied to a gift they had tried to steal. The project director smiled faintly as I slid the signed pages across the table toward him. "We'll finalize immediately, Mrs. Harper," he said. My son's face drained of color. "Mother, what are you doing?" "I'm making sure this house belongs to people who will actually use it for good," I said evenly. "And I'm making sure your names are remembered, just not in the way you imagined." My daughter-in-law shot to her feet. "You can't." "Oh, she can," the attorney interrupted, not even looking at her. "And she just did." The next morning, before they had even finished reeling from the loss, the second part of my plan unfolded. I had kept my phone's voice recorder on during more than one of her rants. One particular gem, her laughing to a friend over wine, saying, "The moment the papers are signed, I'm shipping the old woman straight to a nursing home," had been quietly passed to a local journalist I knew. Oregon is a one-party consent state, which means as long as one person in the conversation agrees to the recording, it is perfectly legal. And I had been agreeing, silently, every time she spat her venom in my direction. That little line of law made the difference between revenge and a lawsuit, and I was very careful to stay on the right side of it. By noon, the recording was everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, local news sites. Neighbors they'd smiled at for years were now turning away from them in the grocery store. Their friends stopped calling. The invitations dried up. By the end of the week, the whispers had become open contempt. Oregon's small, tightly knit community does not forget when someone shows their teeth at family. They were no longer welcome at church functions, neighborhood gatherings, or even the cafe where they used to hold court over lattes. The very people they had tried to impress with their new estate now crossed the street to avoid them. It was poetic, really. They had wanted a house to prove their worth. Instead, they were left with a reputation that no amount of property could ever buy back. And the house they thought they'd live in? It was now a safe haven for women who, like me, had been cast aside, except these women would find nothing but kindness when they walked through its doors. I had given them what they wanted, in a way. Their names were etched in gold letters on a plaque in the estate's grand foyer, but next to it, in even larger letters, was the dedication, in honor of the women who are never forgotten. They wanted my silence to mean weakness, but my silence was just the space I needed to aim. And when I finally took my shot, I made sure it landed where it would never be erased. It was barely 4 months later when the cracks in their perfect little world began to show. The whispers around town had turned into something sharper. Business deals falling through, clients suddenly unavailable, partners withdrawing investments without warning. The public humiliation from that recording hadn't just damaged their social standing, it had gutted their credibility. First, they sold the luxury SUV, the one she used to parade through town as if it were a crown. Then the boat, then the house they'd once called their forever home. Piece by piece, their empire of image crumbled. By the 6th month, they were living in a cramped rental on the edge of town, trying to keep up appearances with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. And then, one rainy afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find them standing there, my son and his wife, looking like the color had been washed out of them. He was thinner, the lines in his face deeper. She looked older too, but not in a way that came from time, more like something inside her had worn out. "Mom?" my son began, his voice low, almost breaking. We don't have anywhere else to go." My daughter-in-law kept her eyes down, her hands twisting the strap of her bag. She didn't speak, and for a moment I wondered if the weight of her own words, spoken months earlier about shipping me off to a nursing home, was pressing on her tongue. I stepped back from the doorway and gestured inside. "Come in," I said. My voice was calm, polite. They followed me into the kitchen, where I poured 2 glasses of water and set them on the table. Neither of them touched the glasses. Their hands stayed folded, restless. He was the one to speak again. "We just need a place for a while, until we can get back on our feet." I sat across from them, studying their faces. For a moment, I saw flashes of the people they used to be, before the greed, before the cruelty. But it was only a flicker, gone as quickly as it came. I took a slow sip from my own glass, then set it down carefully on the table. "You know," I began, "there's a very nice nursing home in the next town over. Good food, clean rooms, friendly staff. You once told me I could choose between a nursing home or a mental hospital," I said softly, my eyes never leaving hers. "Well, I choose neither. But for you," I let the pause hang in the air. "The nursing home sounds perfect. You should try it." The words landed heavy in the air, and I saw them both flinch, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. It was her phrase, thrown back with precision. My son's lips tightened. My daughter-in-law's eyes finally lifted to meet mine, and for the first time she didn't have anything to say. They stood slowly. There was no argument, no plea, just a shared understanding that this door would not be opening for them again. When I walked them to the porch, I noticed a few of the neighbors outside, leaning on fences or pretending to work in their yards. They weren't pretending to ignore what was happening. They watched as my son and his wife walked down the path, their shoulders slumped, disappearing into the gray drizzle. I stood there until they turned the corner, the sea air cool against my face. My hands were steady. My voice had been steady, but inside there was something else, a deep, quiet satisfaction, not joy, not triumph, but the certainty that the ledger I'd been keeping for years was finally balanced. And I didn't need to slam the door behind them. The silence was enough. The late afternoon sun spilled across the garden in a warm, golden wash, turning every leaf into a panel of stained glass. I crouched low among the lettuce beds, the earth cool and soft beneath my fingers. The scent of rosemary and damp soil rose with every movement, mingling with the faint, briny tang of the ocean breeze drifting inland. Somewhere behind me, one of the hens let out a loud, indignant cackle, as if she'd just laid the most important egg in the history of hens. I smiled without looking up. The chickens didn't care about reputations or bank accounts or grand estates. They cared about seeds scattered on the ground, sunlight on their backs, and knowing exactly where they belonged. I reached for another head of lettuce, twisting gently until it came free, the roots dangling with clumps of dark soil. My knees ached a little, but I didn't mind. I had learned to cherish aches that came from honest work. They were nothing like the slow bruising that comes from being diminished every day in your own home. From here I could see the small wooden gate at the edge of the yard. Hanging from it was a hand-painted sign. "Welcome to Grandma's Garden. Entry by invitation only." The letters were bold, the paint still fresh. To most people, it was just a charming decoration, but to me it was a declaration. This was my space. My rules, my peace. I set the lettuce into the basket beside me, the pile already rich with tomatoes, carrots, and sprigs of basil. The rhythm of the work was soothing. Pull, shake, place, repeat. It had a way of settling my mind, the same way the ocean's tide smoothed the stones on the shore. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the highway, the world still spinning with its rush and noise. But in my garden, time slowed to the pace of a heartbeat. I straightened, brushing dirt from my hands, and let my eyes wander over the rows of green. The sun dipped lower, turning my shadow long and thin across the path. My hair, once black and heavy, now caught the light in silver strands that shimmered like threads of spun glass. And in that stillness I spoke, not to anyone in particular, but to the air, to the soil, to the silent witnesses of my life. "Silence does not mean weakness," I said, my voice steady, low. "It only means I am waiting for the right moment to speak my final sentence." A gull cried overhead, circling before gliding out toward the horizon. I watched it disappear into the distance, my heart as calm as the sea it sailed over. There was freedom in knowing that I had chosen my moment, and that I had spoken it without shouting, without rage. Just truth at the exact time it needed to be heard. I bent to gather the last few vegetables, my basket now heavy, the scent of fresh greens rising up with the warmth of the day's end. The chickens wandered closer, curious, their soft clucking like a chorus of approval. As I walked toward the gate, I passed the sign again. The words caught the sunlight, glowing for just a moment before the shadows claimed them. Entry by invitation only. It wasn't about keeping people out. It was about knowing who was worth letting in. I opened the gate, the hinges creaking softly, and stepped inside my home. The garden lay behind me, the sea beyond, and the life I had reclaimed all around. For the first time in years, I closed the door without the weight of unfinished battles pressing on my back. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to be done had been done. And the rest was mine. And that, my dears, is how a quiet old woman from Oregon reminded a few people that silence is not surrender, it is strategy. I didn't need to raise my voice, slam my fists, or fight them on their terms. I simply waited. And when the time came, I spoke in the only language they understood: consequences. If you've stayed with me until now, I thank you. These stories aren't just mine. They belong to every woman who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or pushed into the corner and told she doesn't matter. We matter. And sometimes, we write the ending no one saw coming. So if you want to hear more true stories of betrayal, quiet revenge, sacrifice, and justice served with a steady hand, make sure you subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next tale from the quietest woman in the room who always remembers.